Part 3, Titian. I wrote earlier of a critical event, a critical confrontation with something outside of yourself where the world suddenly looks different. And you have to come to grips with it, you have to think about it, and a germ is planted, and sooner or later you'll have to write about it. In that case, seeing Pirates of Blood River in 1962. There are other critical events that have shaped my own sense of what writing can be and where it can go just as much. Maybe there are hundreds, thousands, but only a few really stand out. No. Reading Moby Dick for the third or fourth time and finding myself overwhelmed at the way a single line early in the book can bring the next 200 pages rushing back as if I'd lived them myself. Which, since this is a book and you're supposed to read it along with all the generations since 1851, I have. Listening to the Firesign Theater's 1969 How Can You Be in Two Places at Once When You're Not Anywhere at All over and over from 1983 to 1988, while writing a book because every time I heard something I'd never heard before, never mind the critical event of them sitting in a radio station in Los Angeles in 1989 as two members of the four-man surrealist radio play recording studio comedy group explained the book to me. Reading The Great Gatsby for the 20th time and still not quite believing that any ordinary person, drunk or sober, could have written, quote, "A fresh green breast of the new world, its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he never understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder." I'm going to reread that quote from A Great Gatsby. Quote, "A fresh green breast of the new world, its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he never understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder," end of quote. It's a critical event that for me never ends. It was only a few years ago, reading that last page, that I saw the way the limitless floating image of the green breast of the new world then falls down, is taken down to the paltry and impoverished image of the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, even if they are only a few lines apart, just as writing this now. It was only in the moment that I noticed that the new world pandered in whispers, as if whispers had never been there before. There's something about the spell the book casts, the way it again and again conjures its own transitory enchanted moments, that makes a reader miss as they read, too carried away by one rhythm, the rhythm beneath its surface, only at some other time. There was the day in 1989 when I was merging on the freeway off the Bay Bridge toward Berkeley with Gimme Shelter on the radio, wondering what it was that had kept it coming out of the speakers for 20 years, wondering what made it seem absolutely new in the strongest sense, somehow unheard, and deciding when I got home that I would have to try to write about that, when a car cut in front of me and I had to change lanes without looking to avoid hitting it, and thinking as my heart went back down to my chest when I realized the lane was clear, that if I had to go, there were worse ways. There was a night in 1970 when at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, on what I remember as a huge screen that was not a rectangle but a square, I saw F.W. Murnau's 1927 silent film Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. Just as with Pauline Kael and Bonnie and Clyde, I began to see what criticism could be, what it could do. There's a moment in Sunrise where the same thing happened, where I felt for the first time I was being given a glimpse of what movies themselves could be. The vamp stands up from the ground where she's seducing the farmer into murdering his wife for her. She begins to shimmy. Sell your farm and come with me to the city. And then suddenly a shaking montage of noise and movement and jazz and dancing takes over the screen, everything happening at once, every image fading into and then rushing out of every other. Smiles exploding over pounding drums and a rush of air. The air of machines and electricity blows through like a wind, blowing trees and farms and rivers right off the map. There was the day in 2013 when I walked into the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice and stopped in front of Jackson Pollock's 1947 Alchemy, one of his first poured paintings, one of his first experiments or proofs that by practicing an arcane art, you really could turn not merely a few cans of household paint into millions of dollars, but turn something anyone might have in a garage into something no one could have predicted, and that had anything been different on the day it was made would never have existed at all. I'd walked past it many times before, but this day I stopped. I stood up close and started looking at it, and then realized I couldn't. There was too much there, too much going on, too much movement, like the montage in Sunrise, which you can't see all at once either. I began to see, or think I did, that just as I can only remember Sunrise on a square screen, now I could begin to discern, to revelate the intention hidden in the chance. I decided I would divide the painting, 87 inches long and 45 inches high, into square inches and look at them one at a time. I stood there trying to see into the first square inch in the top right corner. I did that for 20 minutes before realizing it would take the rest of my life, or another life on top of that, to traverse the whole thing. In 2006, at the Cinema Ritrovato Festival in Bologna, I was invited to present The Manchurian Candidate at the Piazza Maggiore, a huge square with a huge screen hung from a huge building under a blue-black sky. It had been my favorite movie since the first time I'd seen it, and I'd seen it dozens of times since. I wrote a book about it. I knew every line of dialogue, the way every scene was set and unfolded, and yet every time I saw it, everything in it came with the uncanny sense that what was happening didn't have to happen, that there were 1,000 choices between every word or gesture that didn't have to be made in the way that they were. There was always a sense that what was happening could be taken back, that at the end, with Frank Sinatra looking down from himself, as if he has to hide himself from himself, and cursing in shame and despair, hell, it didn't have to end the way it did. The thousands of people watching were silent. As the movie headed toward its climax, they were even more so, as if they had sucked the air out of the night, or the movie was sucking the air out of them. I knew what was coming, but I had never felt what then happened before. Was it the crowd and the aura it gave off, that the whole city, the whole word, history itself, was witnessing this event, and that this event was the end of the world? I think it's supposed to say world there, but it says word. Was it the crowd and the aura it gave off that the whole city, the whole world, history itself was witnessing this event, and that this event was the end of the world? When Lawrence Harvey's first bullet hits James Gregory's would-be president's forehead, and then when his second kills Angela Lansbury's mother, his mother, I felt as if the bullets were entering me. I couldn't move. I was pinned to my chair. After a seeming suspension in time, a long ovation rolled through the piazza. People were cupping their hands around their mouths to join the sound, getting up to leave. But I couldn't move. I sat there until everyone was gone, wanting with everything I had more than I ever had before for it all to come out differently. Finally, I got up and walked through the empty back streets of the city until I couldn't walk anymore. All of those events and more have stayed with me. I've gone back to them wondering what was going on, wondering at works of art or the events they make as one looks and listens again and again, trying to understand what they were saying and what, if I could say to them, but none really measures up to the day I first saw Titian's Assumption of the Virgin. I've always believed that the divisions between high art and low art, between high culture, which really ought to be called sanctified culture, and what's sometimes called popular culture, but ought to be called everyday culture, the culture of anyone's everyday life, the music that we listen to, the movies that we see, the museum objects we pass by or are fixed by, the advertisements that infuriate us and that sometimes we find so moving are false. And as a result of trying to make that argument over the years, or by trying to work as if that argument is so true that it doesn't even have to be raised, I've come to believe that those divisions are permanent. They are as deeply embedded in our culture as racism and war. Those divisions can be denied, but they will never disappear. The Museum of Modern Art in New York dramatized this quite fabulously in 1990 with a show called High and Low. It presented famous pop art paintings, Philip Guston, Crazy Cat and Roy Lichtenstein, Steve Canyon, and True Romance paintings, next to Crazy Cat comic strips and Steve Canyon or True Romance comic books. The pop art paintings were definitely bigger than the comics panels, more dramatic, for that matter, they were more vulgar. But I couldn't understand them. I don't understand now why George Harriman's Crazy Cat strips or the comic books produced by anonymous writers, inkers, and designers were lesser art, really. Why they were not better art, the real art, than the pop art classics Philip Guston and Roy Lichtenstein made of them. I met Lichtenstein once in his studio. Walls and surfaces covered with comics and the mock-ups he had made out of them ready to go. The whole scene reminded me of what Kirk Varnedoe, in 1990 the chief curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA and co-curator of High and Low, said in his companion book to the exhibition. A fine disregard. What makes modern art modern? The title, and the view of the world that it spoke for, came from a stone marker that stands at the gates of the Rugby School in England. One of the most aristocratic schools in the world. Varnedoe, who attended rugby, placed all of modern art on this stone, which commemorates the exploits of one William Ellis Webb, who in 1823, quote, with, end of quote, the stone says, quote, a fine disregard for the rules of football as played in his time, first took the ball in his arms and ran with it, thus inaugurating the distinctive feature of the rugby game. But the working word in the title is less disregard for rules, expectations, and so on than fine. That is, one is being assured that modern art remains art. More than that, it remains the province of the sort of people who for centuries have attended the rugby school, or who sit on the boards of art museums. One is being told modern art will not go too far. Say, quote, disregard, end of quote, without the modifier. And you have no idea what kind of riffraff you might have let in next. Nearly everything I've written is based on the conviction, the learned belief that there are depths and satisfactions, shocks and revelations in blues, rock and roll, detective stories, movies, and television, as rich and profound as those that can be found anywhere else. Wow, fucking A. Pure Matus. In 2015, at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York, I took part in a public conversation with the late conservative philosopher and musicologist Roger Scruton. In his book, The Soul of the World, about the disappearance of the sacred in modern life and how it might be retrieved and restored, in a passage that I quoted back to him, he had defined music as, quote, a perceived resolution of the conflict between freedom and necessity, made available in a space of its own, end of quote. Quote, a reality that cannot be grasped from the ordinary cognitive standpoint, end of quote. I said I thought that the dimension of the sacred, of what could not be grasped by the everyday unthinking mind, could be present in any music. I said that in pop music, blues, rock and roll, jazz, where the listener, whether in solitary or face-to-face or 100 rows back, can at any time be overcome with a sense of unlikeliness, of the listener's own inability to account for what is happening, of what they're hearing, that the listener is struck with a sense of awe, a sense of impossibility, a sense that something is taking place beyond intention, that the composer's or artist's or performer's intention cannot account for the sense one receives of the presence of some force outside the ordinary thinking mind, the intervention of some external intelligence or even gnosis. Scruton had spoken about standing at a train station that morning and how he was overwhelmed to the point of feeling his humanity taken away. by the inundation of canned music, by EDM on boom boxes, by the mechanization of rhythm machines. I told him about an experience I'd had later that same day at the 34th Street Herald Square subway station. Coming up the stairs, I heard someone playing an electric guitar. The sound was made with extraordinary confidence. It was atonal. Notes were shattering in every direction. The volume was like a storm. It was tremendously abrasive and full of life. From the top of the stairs, I walked down to an alcove to see who was making the noise. A middle-aged man, wearing a crown with his name on it. Remy Francois. That conflict between freedom and necessity came into view. He was playing House of the Rising Sun. He was cutting it to pieces, breaking its back. There was something about the melody of the song and the history it carried that held its shape, that could not be taken apart. Here was a song that goes back to the 19th century that was first recorded in 1933 as Rising Sun Blues by the old-timey singers Clarence Ashley and Gwen Foster, was taken up by Bob Dylan in 1962 in a version he borrowed from the Greenwich Village folk singer Dave Van Ronk that 2 years later was heard by the Animals in Newcastle upon Tyne, who made it into a worldwide hit and brought it into the consciousness of people globally, and I said, remain there as we were speaking. Remy Francois, I thought, was affirming the tradition the song had made by saying, in a way, that it could not be broken, and that there were infinite ways of seeing and feeling and taking meaning from that little concert. Scruton demurred, quote, "Let me be strictly honest," end of quote, he said, speaking directly of music. Quote, "I think that the classical tradition, as I understand it, is the greatest achievement of Western civilization, and it contains within it a reflection on the human condition that has no match elsewhere. That is a heretical view from a lot of standpoints, but that is what I think," end of quote. His demeanor and his certainty, the consideration that had gone into his statement of belief, demanded respect, but I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how one could live in that world. Who, I thought, leaving the conversation for questions from the audience, could argue that the sense of transportation, even in the religious sense, being taken out of oneself, connecting the self to something greater, something you know in your heart that every person ever born must experience or be left incomplete, is not as present in the third verse of Gimme Shelter, as Mary Clayton pushes out of herself with the last, "It's just a shot away," with a pause between "it's" and "just," that speaks for a hesitation in the face of history, an immediate apprehension of its weight. That pause, something between taking a breath and the appearance of a new idea, or the scene in The Godfather when the camera is moving in on Michael Corleone so slowly, so inexorably, and Al Pacino says, quote, "Then I'll kill them both," end of quote. As in any art, the most exalted in motive, the most revered in time. Well, I believed all that when one day in 1996, on a first visit to Venice following the advice of art historian friends on what to see, I walked into the Basilica di Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari and saw Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, a 16th century altarpiece painting of the Virgin Mary being borne up to heaven by scores of angels. While people on the earth look up to her, God looks down, and the woman in the middle is caught somewhere between deliverance and terror. It was finished in 1518, 26 years after Columbus reached the New World. the most cataclysmic event in history. The painting was making a different argument. The most important event in history was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and in this place was its mirror. The painting is more than 22 feet high and more than 11 feet wide, as Pollock's alchemy is too dense with the stuff of movement and history to see in a lifetime. This is so big you can barely take it in, no matter how close or far back you stand. Big in size, but big in every other way too. As will and idea, as drama and spectacle, space and time. I was stunned. I thought I knew something about art. I'd seen paintings all over the United States and Europe. I'd been moved to tears by some and scared by others. I'd seen hundreds of movies, listened to thousands of albums, some of them hundreds of times. I thought I knew something about art, and instantly I realized I knew nothing. I was in shock. Again and again, I walked back and forth in front of the painting. I stopped and looked up at it. I walked to the back of the church to see it from a distance. I walked it up to the base again. I did this many times. I kept trying to leave the building, and every time I reached the door, I found myself pulled back in. I couldn't get out. I was trapped by revelation. Yes, I said to myself, I finally understand. The only great art is high art, and the only high art is religious art, and the only true religious art is Christian art. Three things that to the bottom of my life I don't believe. And I was reduced to a puddle of acceptance. I got over it. I've gone back to see the painting over and over. It was still singular, still overpowering, but as a work a team of people once made in a particular time and pace. But that first day stayed with me as a proof that what art does, maybe what it does most completely, is to tell us, make us feel that what we think we know we don't. There are whole worlds around us that we have never seen. I've always bet on that hunch, but until I left the Frary in Venice, it wasn't a conviction or a faith. And keeping faith with that conviction, or trying to, is why I write. Dennis Potter wrote the 1981 Steve Martin Depression musical Pennies from Heaven, and the indelible BBC TV musical series The Singing Detective from 1986, and Lipstick on Your Collar from 1993. In these musicals, people don't just break into song. Old songs descend on them like visitations, and the original recordings come out of their mouths and change them. The actors are lip syncing, but it feels not as if something is being faked, but as if something real but never glimpsed before, is being revealed. A dramatic event, but also an idea, is being set loose in the world. What are the songs? Pop songs from the 1920s into the 1960s, quote, It's a Sin to Tell a Lie, end of quote, by Dolly Dawn, out of Jessica Harper's Simpering Lips, quote, After You've Gone, end of quote, by Al Jolson, quote, Bebop-A-Lula, end of quote, by Gene Vincent, Ewan McGregor performs every word in gestures, quote, Don't Be Cruel, end of quote, by Elvis Presley, Accentuate the Positive by Bing Crosby, Little Bitty Pretty One by Thurston Harris, Blues in the Night by Ann Shelton, The Titanic Pennies from Heaven by Arthur Tracy, danced by Vernal Bagneris, as if there were mouths all over his body. Dozens more. Quote, How do I get that music from way down there, bang up front, end of quote, Potter said once. Quote, And then I thought, they lip sync things. I wasn't breaking a mold. I found the ideal way of making these songs real, end of quote. It was the obvious artifice. Sometimes a man's voice coming out of a female character's mouth, or vice versa, that let the truth of the songs and of the characters feel impossible to refuse. And coming out of that experience, Potter's Manifesto, words I've gone back to again and again since I first encountered them. In an interview Potter did with the film critic Michael Stragow in 1987, quote, I don't make the mistake that high culture mongers do of assuming that because people like cheap art, their feelings are cheap too, end of quote, he said. And continuing, quote, When people say, oh, listen, they're playing our song, they don't mean our song. This little cheap, tinkling, syncopated piece of rubbish is what we felt when we met. What they're saying is, that song reminds me of the tremendous feeling we had when we met. Some of the songs I use are great anyway, but the cheaper songs are still in the direct line of descent from David's Psalms. They're saying, quote, Listen, the world isn't quite like this. The world is better than this. There is love in it, end of quote. There's you and me in it. Or the sun is shining in it. So-called dumb people, simple people, uneducated people have as authentic and profound depth of feeling as the most educated on earth, end of quote. Oh, it's one of the most amazing things I've ever read. And anyone who says different, he said, is a fascist. Quote, I think we all have this little theater on top of our shoulders where the past and the present and our aspirations and our memories are simply and inevitably mixed. Potter said that same day in 1987, 7 years before he died. What makes each one of us unique is the potency of the individual mix. Wow, fuck. Fucking guy. Damn. Shit. Fuck. For a moment in that church in Venice, all of that was in ruins. But that's what art does. That's what it's for. To show you that what you think can be erased, canceled, turned on its head by something you weren't prepared for. Anything. The turn of a shoulder as an actor delivers a line in a play. The way a guitar passage in a song seems to physically turn over as it were a person, as if it were a person. A scene in a movie when the picture suddenly darkens. A break in a collage that dissolves its apparent language into speaking in tongues. The appearance in an advertisement of something that doesn't belong, that doesn't seem to be selling anything, as if it's the designer's letter in a bottle. A gremlin sneaking in after the piece has been put to bed. A cry for help in a fortune cookie. Those occurrences, those tiny critical events, can generate a transformative power that reaches you far more strongly than it reaches the person next to you, or even anyone else on earth. If it reaches any of them at all, art produces revelations that you might be unable to explain or pass on to anyone else, but a revelation that if you are a writer, you might try desperately to pass on in your own words, in your own work.